Chapter 1, Maps of Orientation: Why We Need Inner Maps for Reality. The questions beneath life. You live long enough and eventually notice that beneath almost everything lie a handful of questions that never really leave. Why am I the way I am? Why are other people the way they are? Why do relationships become what they become? Why does suffering change some people and harden others? Why do certain patterns seem to repeat across generations, across families, and even across entire civilizations? And why does the world so often feel simultaneously understandable and deeply confusing at the same time? Most people never sit down and formally ask these questions, at least not all at once. Yet they move underneath life anyway. They live beneath ambition and heartbreak, beneath politics and money, beneath identity, loneliness, success, anxiety, and the strange private negotiations people carry on silently inside themselves every day. If you pay attention long enough, you begin noticing something else as well. Human beings are constantly trying to orient themselves inside reality, even when they do not realize they are doing it. Especially then. The search for an inhabitable reality. For many years, I thought I was simply interested in ideas, psychology, human behavior, meaning, systems, relationships, the rise and decline of civilizations. The question of why some people soften with age while others become more rigid and frightened. But eventually, I realized something quieter was happening beneath all of it. I was trying to make reality more inhabitable. Not perfectly explained. Not conquered, just inhabitable enough that life could be consciously lived instead of merely reacted to. Looking back now, I can see that this search had been unfolding for far longer than I understood while I was inside it. It unfolded through books and conversations, through love and disappointment, through work and exhaustion, through money and grief, and through years spent watching people carefully and noticing which ideas remained standing after life applied pressure to them. Without fully intending to, I began constructing internal scaffolding, ways of understanding things. Not rigid conclusions, but orienting structures, mental footholds that helped reality feel slightly less chaotic, slightly less fragmented, and slightly more coherent. Over time, those structures accumulated, not as a grand theory, but more like sediment, layer after layer of lived contact with reality. Some of it philosophical, some psychological, some practical, some emotional, some painfully earned. Eventually, I noticed that I had spent much of my life circling the same recurring terrains: love, meaning, identity, attachment, money, mortality, belief, human nature, suffering, belonging, self-deception, enough. The same terrains human beings have probably always circled, only wearing different clothes in different eras. Somewhere along the way, reflection stopped feeling like an activity I occasionally engaged in and became a way of metabolizing reality itself. Apparently, this is simply what I do. Fragmentation and the need for orientation. Yet I also think something larger is happening now. Many people can feel it even if they struggle to articulate it clearly. A kind of fragmentation. Not simply political fragmentation, but psychological fragmentation, informational fragmentation, and emotional fragmentation. Too many signals, too many narratives, too many performances, too many incentives pulling attention in conflicting directions. Beneath all of it, many people quietly carry the feeling that they no longer fully know what is true, what matters, or even how to think clearly inside modern life. Not because they are unintelligent, but because human beings were never designed to metabolize this much unreconciled reality all at once. When fragmentation deepens far enough, people begin grasping for certainty. They reach for tribes, ideologies, identities, and explanations that reduce complexity into something emotionally manageable. Which is understandable. Human beings cannot live without orientation. One of the most important realizations I've arrived at is that the question is never whether we are using maps. The question is whether we know we are using them. The maps we inherit. Every human being lives inside assumptions about reality. Assumptions about what people are. About what love is. About what success means. About whether life is meaningful. About whether suffering has meaning. About whether other people can be trusted. About whether enough is possible. about what kind of world this actually is. These assumptions become internal maps, and whether consciously or unconsciously, we live from them. Some maps help us metabolize reality more honestly. Others distort reality while temporarily protecting us from it. Most of us inherit large portions of our maps long before we possess the language or self-awareness necessary to examine them. They come from family, culture, fear, longing, status systems, imitation, pain, and the emotional atmosphere surrounding us, before we are capable of questioning any of it. Often we do not realize we are interpreting reality through these inherited structures until life breaks something important enough to force deeper reflection, which it eventually does for almost everyone. Not as punishment, simply as part of being human. Orientation versus certainty. Over time, I found myself becoming less interested in certainty and more interested in orientation. Less interested in final answers and more interested in inhabitable clarity. Reality is too large, and human beings are too limited, for certainty to become a psychologically stable resting place. Orientation is different. Orientation allows movement. It allows adaptation, revision, and humility. You do not need a perfect map to move consciously through terrain. You only need enough orientation to avoid becoming completely lost. Perhaps that is part of what this project really is. Not a system, not an ideology, not expertise pretending to be omniscience. Rather, an evolving landscape of orienting reflections, maps drawn by someone who has spent a long time trying to look carefully at reality while remaining honest about how partial every map ultimately is. Finished enough. There was a period earlier in life when I imagined that clarity would eventually arrive all at once. I assumed that one day all the pieces would reconcile themselves into a complete worldview, a complete self, a complete understanding. Life slowly erodes that fantasy, not cynically but honestly. You begin to realize that reality is too vast, human beings are too limited, and life moves too continuously for complete resolution to become a realistic condition of conscious existence. Strangely, that realization eventually becomes liberating. Once you stop demanding total certainty from yourself, you can begin building something quieter and more humane, an inhabitable relationship with reality. Not perfect coherence, but sufficient coherence. Enough structure internally that life no longer feels entirely shapeless. Enough self-awareness to notice your own distortions more often. Enough emotional stability to remain in contact with difficult truths without immediately fleeing into denial or ideology. Enough humility to revise your maps when reality contradicts them. Enough grounding to remain psychologically intact while facing uncertainty. And perhaps most importantly, enough acceptance to stop treating incompletion itself as failure. Many people quietly exhaust themselves pursuing psychological finality, as though a human being is supposed to become fully resolved, fully optimized, fully certain, fully healed, and fully beyond contradiction. Yet human beings are living systems, not finished monuments. Wisdom may have less to do with finally arriving at certainty and more to do with learning how to remain consciously oriented within ongoing incompletion. It is the ability to build internal structures stable enough to inhabit while remaining open enough to evolve. That feels closer to reality, closer to the way actual human life unfolds across time. Perhaps that is why the same terrains keep recurring throughout this work. Love, meaning, mortality, attachment, identity, enough, belonging, self-deception, suffering, human nature. These are not merely topics, they are recurring regions of human existence, terrains every person eventually crosses, whether consciously or unconsciously. The older I get, the less interested I become in pretending to possess definitive answers about these terrains. What matters more to me now is whether people can move through them more consciously, with slightly more clarity, slightly more honesty, slightly more compassion, and slightly less fragmentation. Not certainty, orientation. I do not think many modern people are starving primarily for information. They are starving for coherence, for ways of holding reality together internally without collapsing into either chaos or rigid certainty, for ways of remaining psychologically human while facing complexity, for ways of carrying mortality consciously without becoming consumed by fear, for ways of loving without illusion while remaining open-hearted, for ways of existing inside modern life without becoming entirely colonized by noise, speed, outrage, performance, and endless comparison. Perhaps that is what maps are really for. Not to eliminate mystery, not to eliminate uncertainty, but to help us move through reality without becoming completely lost inside it. A map does not become the terrain. It simply helps someone travel through terrain more consciously. That is how I hope these reflections function. Not as commandments, not as conclusions, not as ideological instructions, simply as orienting structures. Partial maps drawn by someone trying, imperfectly, to remain in honest contact with reality across time. Some maps may prove useful, others may eventually require revision. That, too, is part of honest orientation. But if these reflections help someone feel slightly less fragmented, slightly more grounded, and slightly more capable of carrying reality consciously, then perhaps they have already done enough. Because I no longer believe the goal is to solve reality completely. I think the goal is to become inhabitable enough internally that life can actually be lived consciously while remaining unfinished. And maybe that is enough. Or at least, finished enough.